Welcome to our Mastering Scribe Online webinar series, where today's topic will be the XML connector and hierarchical data. My name is Rich Radaci, training manager here at Scribe Software. Now, before we get started, I'd first like to discuss some webinar guidelines. The first one is the incoming audio lines of this webinar will be muted. Now, you'll be able to hear us, hopefully, but we will not be able to hear you. Any webinar content-related questions that you may have can be typed into the questions section of your webinar panel. Your questions will be addressed at the end of our webinar. Please provide adequate detail in your questions regarding the content that you had raised, because this will better help us in answering those questions. The second one is the webinar will be recorded, and it's going to be posted within 48 hours on our website for subsequent review. All attendees today will receive a post-webinar email follow-up providing access to it. Should you encounter any webinar-related anomalies, please navigate to support via the help option in the banner of your webinar panel. Now, joining me today is Mike Bates, a program manager here at Scribe Software. Welcome, Mike, and thanks for being here.
Hi, Rich. Thanks. Good to be here. Always happy to help out.
Great. So, in today's webinar, Mike, I believe we wanted to share with our listeners an essential capability that's available within Scribe Online, and that being the support for XML and hierarchical data. Now, although some of our listeners out there may be thinking that XML is yesterday's technology, quite the contrary. It is still widely used today. Here's an example of why supporting this necessary standard, and that is consider the need to integrate data from a legacy system. And that system may not have an API and/or does not allow access to its database. Well, that's obviously a problem. Its only ability for allowing any potential integration would be in its inherent capability to generate XML. So therein lies the need to be able to support XML.
Yep, that's true, Rich. That's a major motivating factor to this connector, and we'll get into some of those use cases later for sure.
Great. Okay, Mike, drawing on your expertise, I thought we could begin with our defined webinar objectives and then dig a bit deep into the details of XML, connector specifically, and hierarchical data. Sound like a good place to start?
Yep, that's perfect. Let's take a look at where we're going to go today in the webinar. So we'll start out with just an overview of the XML connector in general, and then we'll take a look at some of the requirements for using it, and then look at the operations that are available when you're using the connector. There's some new stuff in Scribe that we've added to support the connector and hierarchical data in general, and we'll look at that. Talk about some of the use cases like we just talked about, and some of the other use cases you would have for the way we've designed it, how to connect to the data in particular, and then we'll have some demos around that connectivity as well as the hierarchical model and how you use it within the Scribe UI.
Great. With these objectives, I'm sure that our audience will be really getting a comprehensive understanding and appreciation of our XML support within Scribe Online.
Yep, that's the goal. So let's start off with just a quick look at XML in general, an overview there. As a prelude to the overview of the actual connector, I just want to first provide a brief description of XML. It's been around for a while, so most people are pretty aware of it. It's over 20 years old. It was designed by the World Wide Web Consortium as a portable and open industry standard file structure, and it's capable of being shared to bridge the gap between incompatible systems, which is exactly what we're looking to do with the connector. The layout of an XML document is best compared to a tree. It's hierarchical data. It's what we're dealing with when we deal with the XML documents, and with the primary root being the parent of the XML, and then the branches being the nodes or the children of the XML that describe its content. They're typically associated with an XSD schema definition, and in fact, we require one with the connector because it helps the interaction with the file in general. And of course, there's a lot more to XML, just a quick overview there. And as you can see on the slide here, the Scribe connector is developed by us. It's Scribe certified. There's no cost to it. And it's out on our marketplace. It's there now. It's been out for a little while. And the main use cases are to read and write files that you really just need a schema definition and a location where those files are going to be. That's the main thing you need to use the connector. And it does handle, as I mentioned, hierarchical data, which includes simple, complex, and collection type properties. We'll get into that as we go through the demo.
Okay, well, you spoke a lot about the schema file, Mike. Now, where does one get the schema definition file?
Right. Typically, you're going to get your schema definition from whoever developed the XML documents that you're trying to create or consume. Whoever's developed that spec will have also developed a schema file. Should it not be available and you just have some sample files, there are plenty of utilities out there on the web that are free that can generate valid XSDs. Just need to be valid against the version 1.0 standard, and then Scribe's able to deal with it.
Got it. Okay.
So moving on, the XML connector right now is enabled for local file access, and so it does require an on-premise agent to access those files. The idea is you're using systems that are able to deposit a file in a folder. And as we discussed earlier, it's both a source and a target connector, and is supported for integration maps, both source and targets. You can create the full, those are sort of our most complex maps you can develop, and you can do a source target connection with those maps. And you can also use it as a target in our request reply maps and our message maps, and those are intended to receive requests from external systems, and then you could use that XML connector to post a file to a location.
So just to be clear in my mind, Mike, when using integration services map, you're saying both the source and target can be XML, which means I can consume and generate XML data files?
Yeah, that's right, Rich. So the connector can be used as a target to generate XML files from a selected source, as a source to enable selected target to consume XML files, or as both if you have a need to transform from one XML format to another. So it's a way to turn a source into an XML generator, turn a target into an XML consumer, or transmit between two formats. And to support these use cases, we've added some new capabilities in the platform to handle hierarchical data, some new block types that are available when using the XML connector, as well as any other hierarchical connector. And again, we'll look at that in detail later.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Mike. So now, can you just tell us a bit more about these new capabilities and design blocks within the XML connector?
Yeah, at a high level, so we've added 3 main new blocks that you use with the XML connector. And I've got them on the screen here, and you'll see the first 2 are what we call container blocks. And that just means they are designed to contain other blocks, and in this case, they also will define a unit of work. So these create with and build with blocks, you'll build up a message, and then at the end of that container, when you've done all the operations, it actually kicks off the write to the XML file.
So I guess I understand now what the difference between the 2 blocks. Maybe help me understand that?
Right. The create with it's pretty basic. So the create with is used for adding records to a file that will contain multiple records. So you're creating an XML file, say, with multiple orders. We would consider an order and all of its lines a single record. If you're going to add many orders to one XML document, you're going to use the create with block. The build with block is used when you want to create one file for each sales order.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that makes sense. Well, how about this add block that you're referring to here on the screen?
Right. And the add block, as I mentioned, the other 2 being the containers, you are using add blocks within the containers. You can use any other Scribe block as well within the containers, but the main point here is at some point you're going to be adding records to hierarchical structures. So in a create with that's going to create an order, you're going to have an add block that's going to add your lines, and it's going to, cursor through the lines from the source, adding each one to that target message before it kicks it off to add to your XML message, or create the new XML message if you're using the build with block. So we'll look at that in our demo shortly. But first, let's talk about some of the use cases that we're targeting here with the XML connector.
Sounds good.
So it's really about interfacing with applications that manage native XML data files, right? Because we're doing this data file exchange. And the key examples are, You've got systems that use XML as an intermediate format. They've designed in an XML layer for that integration purpose. Or you've got XML as an external notification model. So some system that's able to post XML files to your local file system and you want to pick them up, or it can grab them off there and you want to post for them. And then there's a lot of legacy systems out there that, you know, just don't have an API. They've been modified to produce or consume XML files to provide access with minimal, impact on that application. So it's those kinds of applications that this is good for interacting with. And just some examples using those is, you might, as I mentioned before, you could take a Scribe connection and turn it into something that produces XML documents. You could take a Scribe connection and turn it into one that consumes them. That's always can be a handy thing to do when you're integrating with legacy type systems. And within that, and these use cases, you can obviously do ongoing one-time migration if you've got something that's just pumping out a bunch of XML, and you can do your ongoing integrations if it can both produce and consume them. And then, as I mentioned before, you can create processes that transform from one XML format to another.
Okay, well, that certainly makes sense. So Mike, using this connector, are there requirements for connecting into XML, both on the source and target side?
Yeah, so we'll take a look at the connect screen right now, just to see how you will actually create a connection when you're in the connector. There's some source information and some target information. There's a global section, as I have on this screen here. You've got a global area where you can define your path and your schema file, and then there's a read and write section. So let's look at that in the actual product, just so you can see how it is. So if I go into my XML purchase order connection, got our standard stuff at the top. You pick your connector type, you give it a title, it's got an alias. So here's the global section I was talking about. You give the schema path name and the folder path name. Now, in this case, files are going to be read and written to the same folder. If you wanted to have different folders, you just create a different connection, one for your reads, one for your writes. This just simplifies the example. So in my read, I'm going to define the file I'm looking for, and then what do I want to do after that file is processed. I can do nothing, I can move it, I can delete the file, get ready for the next one coming in. And then when I write the file, same thing, what file am I going to write? It's going to write to that same path, and then determine what I want to do afterwards on our standard test area.
And I noticed down there at the bottom, Mike, you have it's your on-premise agent, is that correct?
This is my on-premise, and right, it's not on right now, but yeah.
Well, wait, but I guess my point is that you'd be using an on-premise agent whenever you're dealing with XML.
Yes.
And thoughts on using a cloud agent?
You can't right now because this is local file system access only.
Okay.
We are looking at adding cloud access like our text connector. If you've seen that, it's got some of the drop boxes and things like that.
Right.
We do cloud access.
That's what I was thinking, because we do have that connector, which is supports the cloud agent. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is very similar. It's, you know, these are XML files, but right now it's local file. So now that we've looked at a little bit at the connect dialog, and we'll get into the map in a bit, I just wanted to go over some of the things we've done in the core itself to support the hierarchical data that virtually all XML comes in. You're always really going to have a root node and at least one child, generally many children at many levels, and many sibling nodes within that XML document. So it's, you know, critical to be able to do that. So we've added some things to support it in the core. Basically, what we've done is made the core so it can accept those messages. It used to be you would have to compensate for the core's need for a flat message within your connector. So your connector would get a hierarchical message. The connector code itself would have to flatten it out into a structure that the Scribe core could understand. And then if you had a system on the other side that needed hierarchical, it took some coding to get that working right on the target side as well. So now we can just accept those messages and process them. And so now that we can accept them in the core, we had to add some new types of blocks that we talked about earlier, and that we'll look at in a second in the XML connector. But the general idea is that this really improves the connector development experience against hierarchical data stores. Like I just mentioned, the differences there in the development experience. And connectors, that means that they now need to be developed with this consideration. So, you know, we've got some connectors out there that do this compensation for a hierarchical data source. They continue to now. They'll be rewritten, or if you had one, you know, to take advantage of this hierarchical support. XML really is our first one that we developed to put out internally as an example. There's samples of it on the dev portal so people can understand what it looks like to develop against that hierarchical structure.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so I have two questions, Mike, and then you can certainly answer them one at a time here. It's not the XML connector, I think you've made that clear, but it's the Scribe Online core that's supporting the hierarchical data. That's correct?
Yeah, so without that support, like I said, you'd really have to use the connector to write out that logic that would flatten or unflatten, if you will, on the target side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if the connector had to do that all by itself, that would not be very efficient, would it?
Yeah.
Now, also you mentioned earlier that both simple, actually it was on one of your slides, that both simple and complex XML is supported. Can you speak to a little bit about that?
Yeah, let's dig into that because it's something I like to talk about a little bit in case people aren't familiar with it, or if you're used to the way Scribe worked before we had hierarchical support. There's a couple of other new things besides the blocks I talked about. So with what I would call flat support from before, you went in, you chose an entity from an entity list, and you still do that with like an XML, you'll have an entity list. And then you got a list of properties, and those properties were basically what we would call simple properties, which is just a simple property is a field with a data type. It's about as simple as you can get. And that was really all you could access within Scribe. And so now what we've added are the ability to access complex properties and collections and arrays. And so just a little example I here have on the right. So the purchase order is the entity in this case, and then the purchase order will have some fields on it that I don't show. Those would be the simple properties. Ship to and bill to represent what we would call complex properties because they've got within them several different types. They can have simple types, they can have arrays, they can have sort of everything. But in this case, these are just simple types with you know, some string fields, some numeric fields. So the ship to and bill to kind of represent that complex type. And then I've got this items node, that's a node in our XML that represents a collection, and that just means it's got, you know, the items collection has a collection of individual item rows in it. And on the other side here, which we'll see the same thing in the UI, you can kind of see how it's represented in the query block. When I'm going to query, I've picked the purchase order entity in this case. That's the top level. Then you see the items, and you can see there's only one items collection, but within it there can be many item rows. And the bill to and the ship to show up as one-to-ones because although they have many fields within them, each one can appear only once. So let's again go back to the UI and see what that's going to look like. Sorry about that. I'll get out of my connection. So again, talking about XML on the source, I'm querying POs in my XML document. I've chosen my entity's purchase order. Now, in a standard connector, we had relationships. We've changed this to an include, just to sort of encompass both hierarchical and non-hierarchical data stores. And this is just what we saw. You'll see your collections. You can collapse them, can choose whether to include them in your query or not. And similar to the inner outer join stuff, you can choose to include records that have this child, you know, or related record or included record or not. And then you can see again the addresses are one-to-one. And what this is going to look like is you now have, let's go back out to when you have my example here, I'm creating a purchase order in Salesforce. When you go into your create block and you look at your links, I've got, like I said, here's the purchase order top entity, and here are my simple properties on it. I've got a comma and a date. It's very simple, 2 strings. Now I've got my my bill to and ship to addresses are right here because they're a one-to-one. So what we've done is, you know, this is the XSD at work. The schema is telling Scribe there can only be one bill to and one ship to address at the top level. So we just tack it right onto the top level, and you have access to those fields right at the purchase order level. And you can map those. You can see they're mapped over here on the right. You have access to all the fields within those entities. Now the items entity becomes an entity. So by the fact that I chose it in my query as an include, and I put it down to the line item level, now it's available in my for each. Because I chose it in that query block, I have it in my for each, and now I can loop through each of the children there. So that's the way you build up. You can build up, as many levels deep as you need to access, and as many siblings as you need to access. And then, Salesforce is set up like a standard relational database. You create the order header, and then you create the line items, and we do that just by looping through that child record. So that's a little bit of what it looks like on the source side. And then just to demonstrate the target side, because that's going to be a little different. So I have another example where I'm taking that same purchase order out of a relational database, in this case, again, Salesforce, and putting it into an XML document. This is a standard. This is my Salesforce connection. So this looks a little more like usual. I'm querying the purchase order. I'm only bringing in the lines with it. You see the relationship looks a little different because this is the standard connector design that we've had. It doesn't have the hierarchical support that the XML connector has, but still has the sort of inner and outer join concept where you return records with or without line items. You make that choice. So now as I loop through my orders from Salesforce, I want to create an order for each one within my XML file. And as I mentioned, here's this create container block, and everything within here is going to be a part of that order. And when it hits this commit is when it knows to create that order in the document. And so we need to first just create the purchase order part of this message. So we're going to, again, it's the XML side of it. We're choosing the purchase order, and I look at the mappings. And as we saw before, I've got my bill to address. Those fields are in there. Those one-to-one, it's a one-to-one complex type with the simple types within it. There's the ship to, same thing. And there are those fields that are just at the order level itself. So I've got those three kinds of fields. That step is going to create that. It's going to start to create the message, basically. It's going to populate it with the header stuff. Then I'm going to move through the line items. And for each Salesforce line item, again, that's been joined in, I'm going to use that new add block we have. And again, because I've chosen this as a relationship that exists, sorry, just going back to my create block here, I forgot to go back into the include. Again, you're saying I'm going to create my sales order with these things in it. So there's the sales order. I get access to those fields in this create with block. Then by adding this items underneath, I get access to items when I create a for each. So I go into my for each, and that's why I'm able to pick out the, that's for each from Salesforce. By picking it in the create block, the create with block, I'm able to access it in the add line to the XML message. Right? So that's why I'm able to pick that related entity here. And then again, I've got my fields I can map from my source line item into my target line item. And so it's kind of similar to the other direction.
So Mike, would this be, this particular design that you're sharing with us now, would this create a single XML file with multiple line items within the purchase order?
It would, and that's because I'm using the create with block. Here we talked about there's that build with block.
Right.
And that also requires a little bit different of an XSD configuration. So it's sort of, partially defined by the XSD, and then you use this block and that. But it would be in the same place this create with is, and it would create a different file.
It would create multiples at that point. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. So just to reflect on what you just shared, you showed actually the Salesforce as being a source versus XML being the source, and vice versa on the target side.
Yeah, so showing kind of going from relational to hierarchical, going from hierarchical to relational, common.
And you can, as we had talked about earlier, you can do XML to XML as well.
Yep, I could have XML source and target and just change the format by using those source and target features I showed on the XML connector.
Right, right. Okay, all right. Well, it's very good material, Mike, and thank you for this contribution that you're sharing with us today.
Sure, absolutely. Glad to do it.